From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Car Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan and his guest this week, Mark Evanier, to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the show. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode. And if you did, always do us a favor and like, share, comment, subscribe, and all that fun jazz to keep the gravy train running. But besides that, this week, yet again, another great exemplary guest of what this show is all about, talking to interesting people with great stories and hopefully doing your best to ask good questions. And even though this man says that he is as humble as can be, when you gaze upon his resume, it feels as though you're looking at a menu from the Capitol Grill on 700 West 9th Street. Not only is he one of the most gifted men of his lifetime when it comes to telling stories, but he has also been the backbone of several generations' childhoods as a writer or a co-writer of pieces of cinema lore such as Garfield and Friends, of which is celebrating its 35th anniversary, Dungeons and Dragons, Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, Welcome Back Kotter, The Garfield Show, and many more. When he's not creating magic through television writing, Mark Evanier has spent the last 50 years showcasing his skills of being one of the standard bearers of comic book creation with stories ranging from superheroes to cartoon characters as well as Gru the Wanderer. It is my highest distinction, pleasure, and honor to be joined this week by Mark Evanier as my guest. Sir Mark, how are you today?
Okay. Wow. Listening to that, I feel like I should have some money someplace.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm surprised the mayor of LA has not knighted you Sir Mark yet, but I'm sure that's coming shortly.
They will probably do that in lieu of money. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
They'll give you honors in this town, but they won't give you a check sometimes.
Yeah. They'll give you a street name or an honorary street name or Walk of Fame, but no money.
Right.
We'll still have to carry on. Well, as I said, we talked briefly about how life's going right now, and as of this recording, 4th of July is tomorrow. So does Mark have any big plans for the big holiday?
I'm just going to kind of sit here, hear the fireworks go off and all the pets in the neighborhood scream and dive for cover. No, I'm just going to sit here and write all day, which is kind of what I do in my life. I just sit around here and write. Well, and every so often I interrupt it for a podcast.
Nothing's wrong with that. So, well, I'm honored that you chose to interrupt for this. It's nothing's wrong with spending a little time writing. It's nice and peaceful and relaxing. A guest I had on last week was part of the music industry. He's a music producer, engineer for a lot of the big name artists, ZZ Top and Lenny Kravitz and so on and so forth, Led Zeppelin. And not only is he a producer behind the soundboard, but he's also done a lot of work on his own with his own solo career. And I asked him, which is sort of a question I like to ask everyone I have on. With him, he saw the last 3 years affect his industry to a great extent, both positively and negatively. So for yourself, seeing as you've written for both television, you've also done you're voice acting director and obviously comic books. What's it been like to see movies and entertainment enjoyed in person again, seeing as you're also like a music historian?
Well, I haven't gone to that many movies. I wasn't going to that many movies before the pandemic hit, and I think the only movie I've gone to since in the last few years was they had a screening of my favorite film. It's a Mad World out of Theater de Santa Monica, and I couldn't miss that because that film is only well enjoyed when you're on a big screen with a big crowd. And a lot of films are perfectly fine on my home TV. And that one isn't. That one is an audience experience. You need my girlfriend has never seen the film. And I haven't shown it to her because there hasn't been a moment where I could take her to see it in a big venue and with a big audience. And I'm hoping that'll happen soon. She's been unavailable whenever they've shown it lately. But no, during the pandemic, the line I was using with people, they were saying, how has your life changed? And I said, well, instead of sitting in front of my computer all day writing, I'm sitting in front of my computer all day writing. And the only real difference is that I've learned the joys of DoorDash and Instacart. Yeah. And now that I can go out, I'm still enjoying DoorDash and Instacart, delivering stuff. And that gives me more time to sit here and play at the computer and write and, or do Sudoku puzzles in lieu of writing.
There you go. If I'm not mistaken, isn't the movie It's a Mad World celebrating a big anniversary this year?
Well, yeah, it came out in 1963, November of 1963. So everybody can do the math on that. And I saw that film the day after Lee Harvey Oswald shot John F. Kennedy and the day before Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. child.
Oh, wow.
So it's very easy to place it in history.
Sure.
And it was a day that a lot of people needed to get out to a funny movie and escape because things were so depressed. And that film was one of maybe a half dozen things I can look back and think my life changed that day.
What I also like asking to some of the guests I have on is sort of a reflection on themselves during the last few years and what they've learned about themselves. So what has Mark Evanier learned about himself during the last 3 years they didn't know prior?
I've learned that I don't need to go places. I've learned that I'm lazy about everything except coming in here to my little office and sitting at this silly chair and writing stuff and reading stuff on the internet. And I just actually found a certain joy to that, to the point where now when people want to have meetings, I say, can we do them on Zoom instead of me actually having to, shower and go into the meeting?
Sure.
Drive to Burbank or whatever it is. Oh, hold on, let me turn my phone off there. Sorry. Okay. I just really, I don't know. I've learned a lot of ugly things about some people who didn't seem to take the pandemic seriously, people around us, and conspiracy-minded people and how to avoid them maybe. I've learned that you need sometimes to get in touch with how you really feel about things. A lot of times I find it's important to stop and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Here is my goal at the moment. Why is that my goal? Do I really want that goal? Or is there another goal that I would prefer? So I think you sometimes have to take the time to figure out what's important and what matters to you. And sometimes you discover, at least in my case, that there are things other people want, and I kind of wanted them because I assumed you're supposed to want those things. And then I realized, well, but I don't.
Yeah.
So it helps to focus on where you're going, and what you're trying to do, to really understand what a situation is about. I find that I cannot solve a problem in my life unless I really understand what it's about. If I can't solve a problem, either it's not solvable or I don't know enough about the problem to solve it. So for whatever that's worth.
Another guest that I had on, he talked about how he grew up in New York and how he found a love very early on in film, in the film industry, directing, writing, and so forth, whereas his parents had a very different sort of background as a psychoanalyst, and his mother died at the young age, but all of his other friends were either doctors or things of that nature, lawyers. But for you, reading upon you, being that your father experienced a very, emotional in the sense of he did not enjoy working for the IRS, and that was something he was, I don't want to say had misery about, but an experience that he did not enjoy. And he told you, I believe, at an early age to find what you love and do it. So for you, seeing that firsthand and the disenchantment he had about it, how much of that compared to maybe your love in general of comic books made you want to join the writing industry?
Well, it wasn't so much comic books in themselves, although comic books were a very important part of my life and still are. What it was that I just was fascinated by stories, books, not necessarily comic books, movies, TV shows, and such. And at some point early on, as you mentioned, my father hated his job, and it was a job, it wasn't a career. I think in this world, it's important to separate those two distinctions. A career is something that fits into the phrase, when I grow up, I want to be a blank. Nobody says, when I grow up, I want to be stockroom clerk at Costco.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a noble job for those who wish to do it, but it's not something that you are so much as what you do.
Sure.
If you are the stockroom guy at Costco, and I don't know why I'm picking on that profession, but and you lose your job at Costco, you no longer have an identity. But if you're a writer or an artist or a poet or creator or something like that, you are not defined by your paycheck this week.
Sure.
You're a writer even when no one's paying you. You're an artist even when no one's paying you. And my father had a job, worked for the IRS. And I have friends who at some point in their life, they realized they didn't want a job, they wanted a career. Both of them can get you a paycheck every week. Both of them can pay the rent. Both of them can buy groceries. But there's a level of satisfaction you get when you're advancing your career into more things you wish to do, more ways you wish to explore that activity.
Sure.
And so what I wanted, I realized early on, was I wanted a career. I wanted to do, I didn't want to, and as it turns out, in my 50 some odd years, 54 years now, I think it's been, I've been a professional writer. I have never been exclusive to any one writing job or to any one company. I don't think I've ever had more than 50% of my income come from any one source. Now, there are people who I know who, when you tell them that, they're horrified by the concept of being a freelancer, because it's like, wait a minute, you don't know where your paycheck's coming next month. Yeah. I couldn't live like that. I had a friend wanted to be a writer very badly, more so when he saw that I was doing it. And he moved to Los Angeles and he started making an adequate amount of money, not huge money, but enough to pay his rent, buy Cheerios and things like that. But it drove him nuts that he didn't have something, a paycheck every Friday, a predictable paycheck every Friday. And I've never had that. Only in short-term instances when I was on staff on a TV show. And even then, it wasn't my sole source of income. And he finally just went to work for the phone company as a technical writer. It wasn't what he wanted to do with his writing, but he just couldn't cope with that, what do I do next week mentality. And, and one of the things that has happened over the years, and the pandemic kind of exacerbated this, is that not everybody, but more people than ever are becoming freelancers.
Sure.
When I was writing stuff in the 70s, I had a lot of friends who worked at Hanna-Barbera or Disney or some big studio who thought they were going to be there forever. They thought that was a job they would have for their old age. They might leave it, but that was always there. There was one artist I worked with a couple of times, a very good freelance comic book artist. And we had lunch one time and he complained that he'd done a job for Hanna-Barbera, one of the cartoon shows, and they'd shorted his check. He was supposed to get $900 and he got a check for $600 or something like that. And I said, well, why don't you call the union? Why don't you complain? He said, oh no, I don't want to be a troublemaker. Hanna-Barbera will always be there. Yeah. I can always rely on it. They'll always have work for me. Well, guess what? Hanna-Barbera isn't there anymore.
Yeah.
And my friends who worked at Disney were saying, yeah, maybe the job doesn't pay that wonderful, but it's secure. I'll always be there.
Sure.
None of those people are Disney anymore.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand how I could survive without having a place. And there are people, to go talk about the comic book industry or the animation business, who get their identity wrapped up in their employer. I know a couple of guys who were working for DC Comics, and they were DC company men, and they loved DC, and DC was great, and DC was the greatest company in the world, and I wouldn't want to work for that Marvel terrible company for anything. Then they lost their job at DC, and they managed to get into Marvel, and then Marvel was the greatest company in the world, and they wrapped their identity around working for Marvel, and that's not a good thing, because one day you won't be working for Marvel. All these companies are volatile. They change owners. They change management. Sure. Right at this moment, if I talk to someone who works at DC Comics, they will frequently say to me, have you heard anything? Is there a management change coming? Have you heard who I'm going to be reporting to next month? They're nervous about it.
Sure.
And right now, getting a job which puts you in one place for 2 years seems like long-term employment.
Yeah.
In 1970, that seemed like a temp job to people. So you don't get wrapped up in that. One of the smartest people I've ever encountered in show business, as far as knowing how to manage a life and a career, is Jay Leno.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Jay Leno, he was on NBC for 20 some odd years, he had an office which, if he got fired, if all of a sudden they fired him, he could clean out his office with one trip down to the car. He had so few, he didn't have, and I have friends who they hire the company, and they come in and they decorate the office. It's their home away from home. They put up pictures, they put up drapes, they buy furniture for their office. So it's like a little place to feel like they're at home.
Yeah.
And then when they get fired, or even if they get moved, they're just devastated because it's like they're suddenly homeless.
Sure.
And Jay was smart enough, even though he had about one of the most secure jobs in show business for a while there, he didn't make it his whole life.
Sure.
And it wasn't even his A job. His A job was stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
His B job was hosting the Tonight Show,
Yeah.
doing 5 hours of network television a week. And I think that's a very good way to approach life sometimes, to not just get wrapped up in one thing.
Steve Stoliar, who I'm sure you know, who worked with Groucho, wrote in his book and other interviews he's done, he's talked about how when he moved from Missouri out to California, he was on a plane ride with Andy Griffith and Red Buns, I believe, and how he got two different reactions when going up to them. Seeing as you're a Southern California guy through and through, you're born there, you live there, I'm sure you had some experiences with interacting with Hollywood growing up. I know there was a moment with Jerry Lewis in the doctor's office, but for you as a kid growing up in there, did that have any influence in terms of any opportunity for you potentially to enter that type of realm?
You know, Nolan, you're not going to get very far in the podcast world if you're going to keep doing research. It's not, nobody else does this. I'm impressed by that. I had lots of encounters with Andy Griffith. My next door neighbor when I was growing up in West Los Angeles was Betty Lynn, who played Thelma Lou on the Andy Griffith Show. And she took my parents and me on the set of the Andy Griffith Show when I was 11, 12, something like that. I went to Mayberry. I got to meet Andy Griffith. I played handball with Ron Howard
there you go.
for a little bit. And I got to meet Barney Fife. Not Don Knotts. He was Barney Fife the whole time I was around. He was in character and he stayed in character, which was just lovely. Now you flash forward years, and I met a man named Howard Morris that day, who played Ernest T. Bass on the Andy Griffith Show. Although he was there that day because he was directing the episode they were going to film next week. He was a director, and I met him that way. And then years later, I became good friends with Howie Morris. He was on the Garfield show as a regular. He became like my crazy uncle. I loved him, and I had Betty as my crazy aunt.
Yeah.
So and then one day I was at Howie Morris's funeral, and I'm sitting, and there is Betty Lynn sitting on this side of me, and Andy Griffith sitting on that side of me, or I think I had one or two other people in between. And I just realized, first of all, what nice people they were.
Sure.
What good people they were. The day of Howie's funeral, this will impress very few people, but it impressed me. Andy Griffith was living in North Carolina at the time. He was in his mid-80s. He got up that morning. He put on a very nice, beautiful suit, real handsome suit, a suit that screamed TV movie star, you know. He got on in a limo. The limo took him to the airport. The airport flew to LAX. Limo greeted him there. He got into the limo. It drove to Hillside Memorial, which is a Jewish cemetery not that far from the airport. Came in, he greeted everybody. He sat there, paid his respects. He did not speak. He just showed his respect for Howie and love for Howie by showing up. He chatted with people, shook some hands, went out, got into the limo, went back to LAX, got on the plane, went back to North Carolina, took the limo home. That's a hell of a day for a man in his 80s.
Sure.
And he didn't do it to show the press. There was no press there. He didn't do it to speak and show everyone in Hollywood how. He just did it because it was the decent thing to do. And Howie was only in 6 episodes of the Andy Griffith Show, and he directed 3 or 4 more. He wasn't even, one of the most important people in that show.
Sure.
But Andy respected him and felt that, he should be there. And I just thought that was very neat. And Betty, of course, was there because she knew Howie from all their personal appearances together and working on the show. And a lot of Howie's friends were there. And there was just loving, wonderful things said. Carl Reiner gave the best eulogy I've ever heard in my life. I sat there wishing that I A, knew Carl Reiner, and B, would die before he did so he could speak at my funeral. Anyway, I'm here and he's gone now, so I guess he's not going
to. I'm curious because I also, in another interview you did, I'm not sure if it was on Gilbert's podcast or wherever it was, your neighbor Betty introduced you to Betty Davis, I believe, correct?
Betty Davis, yeah. The Betty Lynn, the Lynns lived next door to us, and they were lovely people. I mean, it was like a family, you know. We just, like I said, Betty was like an aunt to me, and they had a tradition in their home. Every Christmas Day, they would first of all walk down to church in the morning. They were very religious people. And then in the afternoon, around 2:00, they would welcome some friend of theirs in for drinks on Christmas Day. They'd have a little thing in the living room. They'd invite somebody that Betty had worked with in her film career, because Betty had a wonderful film career before she was ever on the Andy Griffith Show. In fact, the Andy Griffith Show was like the 5th TV show she was even on. Anyway, so one day, so every year on Christmas Day, we would have the Evaniers presents for the Lynns, and the Lynns would call up and say, "Oh, could Mark come over? We have a present for your family, and we want him to meet someone here." And I would take the Evaniers present for the Lynns over and bring back the Lynns presents for the Evaniers, of course, but they would introduce me to their guest. And one year it was Betty Davis, and one year it was Fred McMurray, and one year it was Roddy McDowell. I mean, people like that who, and they thought it would mean a lot to me to meet these people, which is what did. It also meant a lot to those people that an 11-year-old kid knew who they were.
Sure.
That I knew who Betty Davis was. Not the way I know about, you know, who I would have known who Buster Keaton was or Laurel and Hardy were, but I certainly knew who Betty Davis was, and I knew who Roddy McDowell was. It was just a very nice thing. And it got me over any fear I might have had of celebrities or of meeting people, which is an important thing to do if you're going to work in show business at all. You've got to, you know, not be flabbergasted and tongue-tied by meeting someone famous. My first tape day on Welcome Back Kotter, as you probably know the story, Groucho Marx was on the set. And I had met Groucho before that once. And shortly after that, I went up to Groucho's, I was at Groucho's house, where I passed Steve Stollier in the halls. Apparently we didn't meet that day, but we later became friends. And you know, it's you have to find your place in the world vis-a-vis all these important people. You have to be able to talk to them without being a drooling fanboy, to use a term I don't like, but also not to presume you're an equal in stature, because, you know, for one thing, they got a lot more money than than you do, but a lot more history. And you have to respect what they do without find that sweet spot between being a fan of it and being a fellow professional on maybe a little different tier.
Well, that's like Nicholas Meyer, who directed Star Trek 2 and 6 and wrote part of 4. I had him on a few weeks ago, and that was a moment like that. And not just Star Trek, but other things, the 7% Solution, the Day After, things of that nature. A guy who's been very successful. And of course, as you said, you don't want to fanboy and drooling over the place, but you also want to be professional.
I was introduced to Nicholas Meyer at a Writers Guild strike. I'm not sure which one, because there have been so many of them. A mutual friend introduced us, and he had done Time After Time. That time, which I thought was a wonderful movie, but for some reason, I complimented him on Invasion of the Bee Girls, and I saw his face kind of crumble a bit, like, "Oh, that's what you liked of mine?" I go, "No, it just happens to have been something I saw recently." And, but you know, you have there's a lot of people who in the show business, I'm including comic books and animation and such. They feel a sense of competition with other folks. Like, you know, am I more important than you? Am I better known than you? Do you have more money than me? And you have to wipe that out. It's not a matter of that. You're not in competition with people just because you're introduced to them. And you have to put that aside and just talk to them like people, like human beings. And a few of them you can't, because they have that sense of I've got to show off. I've got to be the alpha male who dominates a
Sure.
conversation or whatever. But I managed to get along with like 98% of all the people I meet, and some of them are pretty important people, and some of them are people who on the other end of the spectrum, they're out of work or whatever, and you have to just deal with them as individuals and not start thinking of that there's a caste system involved, and where are you vis-a-vis them in the caste system.
Eventually you would become an assistant for Jack Kirby, who you grew up adoring and loving his work, similar to Steve growing up loving Groucho Marx and of course ending up working for him. There's a balance that needs to be done. We sort of already talked about this, of being a fan and appreciating the work he did, but also being professional, because you don't want to change the dynamic of relationship or lose the opportunity. For you, how difficult was that working with Jack compared to maybe any other situation that you would work with people?
Well, with Jack, it was tricky because Jack was not appreciated. Jack was not treated very well by the business that he saved time and time again. He did not get the recognition he deserved. He certainly did not get the financial rewards that he deserved. And so, when you inherit someone like that and you fall in love with them, you inherit some of their problems and some of their frustrations. There are people who were kind of idols of mine who over the years, I think I got a little too close to.
Sure.
I think I saw sides of them I wish I hadn't seen and inherited some of their problems by osmosis. Now, Jack wasn't one of those, but first of all, you couldn't be around Jack and not learn something. He was a very enriching person. And, I do these panels every year at Comic-Con about Jack. And the overwhelming theme in the room is that everybody in the room who loved Jack's work felt they got something from him. And it wasn't just learning how to draw superheroes. It was a philosophy of life, an approach to the world. He was a very smart man, and he was a very perceptive man. And I am pleased that I was around to remember some things he said and be able to quote them back later, so people would realize how prescient he was.
Sure.
He predicted what Comic-Con would become.
Oh, wow.
He predicted lots of things over the years that at the time seemed ridiculous. And years later you go, hey, Jack knew this was going to happen. So what the frustration was that he had left Marvel because he wasn't treated very well there.
Yeah.
And then he went to work for DC and he wasn't treated very well there either.
Oh, wow.
In some ways better, but in some ways worse. But it still was not a full realization of what he deserved. Sure. And the industry was lesser for that. There are, sometimes treating your employees well is the best investment you could make because they become so valuable to you.
Sure.
And there was a point there where nobody at Marvel really thought, my God, if this man comes up with just one more Silver Surfer, it's worth millions and millions of dollars to us. Sure. Let's keep him happy. Let's keep him producing stuff for us. Instead, they treated him like an interloper at times, and there were people up there who actively worked against him. That was same as true at DC. It's very frustrating to be fragged by your own troops.
Sure.
And especially when you already won the war for them twice. Yeah. So you feel for these people. Like I said earlier, you discover that celebrities are human beings. Yeah. Well, you also discover that people you admired have frustrations.
Yeah.
Places where they've been mistreated, resentments. It's just like anybody else. There's a guy who used to be very active in comic fandom, and he was organizing some things with comic book artists and panels, some seminars and things. And at one point he said, I'm going to have this guy and this guy talk to a two-man panel together. And I said, well, this guy hates this guy. And this guy, it might be better not to put those two people on the same panel. And this guy literally put his hands over his ears. And he said, stop. I don't want to hear that people in comic books don't love each other. I don't want to hear this kind of thing. He wanted to believe that everybody would link arms and sing Kumbaya. Yeah. We're all brothers together and we're all happy and nobody ever wronged anyone else.
Sure.
Well, there's no industry like that.
Yeah.
There's people in this, if you have a business which has any sort of success in it, it has failure in it, and it has people who get ahead by stepping on other people. It's impossible to not have that.
Sure.
And so you have to cope with that. And I had cases where I knew, this artist and this performer, and I knew that they hated each other, but I was trying to stay friends with both of them. And, not get sucked into the, don't you hate him? Isn't he terrible thing? No. I can like both of you. I can respect both of you.
Sure.
I don't have to take sides in everything.
I'm curious, at working with, whether it be at the same time as Mr. Kirby or a little after you experienced the industry working with him closely, was there a bucket list for you in terms of what you want to work on or where you want to work in terms of comics or comic books, or were you just happy to look for something and hopefully stick on to it?
Well, one of the things I learned from Jack was that, there's a quote that's famous because I remembered it from Jack and I repeated it. He read in some fanzine that some kid was taking over drawing. I think it was Captain America, one of his old books. And he said, I'm going to do stories in the Kirby tradition. And Jack said, the kid doesn't get it. The Kirby tradition is to create something new, create a new book.
Yeah.
Not take over somebody else's. And Jack, while he respected everybody's need to make a living and everybody's contribution to keeping a comic book going, to him, the giants of the industry were the people who created something that wasn't there before.
Sure.
If I had emerged from my association with Jack, able to draw just like him, he would have considered me a failure because I hadn't created anything.
Sure.
I just imitated. And so one of the things that I did learn from him was that you don't aspire to write Fantastic Four or Superman or that. If some of you want to do that, it's okay. But if you've got any real creative instincts at all or any good feeling, you should go beyond continuing someone else's work.
Sure.
There's nothing ignoble about it. I've done very well expanding on Jim Davis's work with Garfield.
Yeah.
But you should also be more than just a guy who follows other people.
Sure.
So I have friends who thought, oh God, if only I can write Spider-Man. That's my dream.
Yeah.
I never had that. If they'd asked me, I might have taken a crack at it, but that didn't matter to me. What mattered to me actually was kind of like finding interesting adventures, interesting situations, to be able to do something and really enjoy it. And I tell some people, I sometimes feel like I got into the business of the anecdotes, the interesting experiences, and the colorful part of the business. Show business can be a lot of fun.
Sure.
And writing comic books can be a lot of fun, and whatever it is. I never had a better time than I was directing the voices in the Garfield cartoons.
Yeah.
That was just great working with all those talented people and directing them was a matter not of directing them, but of like saying, okay, you're playing this part. There's your microphone. Here's your script.
Yeah.
And just correcting them once in a while if they didn't get what I had in my head.
Sure.
Because you don't direct a Frank Welker, or you don't direct, Howie Morris, or you don't direct. We had like people on the original Garfield and Friends show. I could hire anyone I could get for the money we paid. So I brought in everybody I could find who was in the movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. So we had Don Knotts on the show. We had Jonathan Winters. We had Buddy Hackett. We had Marvin Kaplan and Arnold Stang. We had all these people who were, and here's my chance to, work with them and talk with them.
Yeah.
And to, bond a little with this movie I love so much, and other shows or movies I loved. On the last Garfield show, we had Rose Marie from the Dick Van Dyke Show in an episode, and the Dick Van Dyke Show was as important to me as anything I ever saw on television.
Sure. I'm curious. I'm curious in the terms of the creative aspect, because although this is a creative element in of itself to a degree, a creative element like that you have been part of and you've inputted and sort of raised to a higher level is something I don't have the skills for. Nevertheless, I'm curious from your perspective whether it's something that has already have been going on, like a Garfield or a Yogi Bear or something of that nature, or Welcome Back Cotter, where either you're joining at the beginning or when it's already started, what is the percentage of you wanting to, keep the story the same to an extent, the overarching story, but also trying to be as creative as possible, but also being realistic?
Well, it depends. Obviously, it's case by case. When I went on Welcome Back, Cotter, my partner Dennis and I were the news story editors. We had very little power. And the goal was not actually, we were brought in to kind of change the direction of the show a little bit, to nudge it in certain directions. The show was getting a little silly, and some of the people at the network and some of the people who controlled the show were saying, we got to get away from this kind of story and do more of this kind of story. So our goal, our assignment was to take the show more in this direction. But you're contributing.
Sure.
It's a team effort. A TV show like that, you get to the point where you look at the finished show and you go sit there going, okay, I think I wrote that line. Oh, I might have written that one. Well, that one sounds like, you're, it's the same way, probably the left fielder in a baseball game, is proud they won the game, but he only caught the ball 4 times in the entire game. He contributed.
Sure.
He contributed by being there, because they had to have someone in left field, even if nobody hit the left field during that game. And, he caught the ball and threw it the right place at the right time. So, you don't take a bow like you won the game.
Sure.
There's other things, and that's one of the reasons I love doing comic books. When you do comic books, between you and the audience are about 3-4 people.
Sure.
TV shows, hundreds. And a cartoon show, there's hundreds of people involved, some of whom often do not speak English. Even you never meet them, because these shows are animated in Taiwan, or they're animated in the Philippines, or wherever. So you are only have an impact on a certain part of that, and he's not your character. You can't decide to suddenly change him a lot. The assignment is to do something. Or if you were writing, like I wrote an episode of one of Bob Newhart's sitcoms, I'm not changing Bob Newhart. And my job is to write something that Bob Newhart would say, and he delivers it. And they'll change the script if it isn't that. So it's an interesting challenge. It's you can't wrap your entire identity around in being part of other people's work. You have to have something of your own that you feel proud of. And it may just be that, like I used to write for stand-up comedians, and I'd watch them on the Tonight Show, and a joke I wrote got a huge laugh. Now, there's no credit there. Gary Shanley didn't stop and say that joke was from Mark Evanier. There's no credit for that, but it got a huge laugh, and I was proud of that. I had done my job well, and you can take pride in that, even if you're not credited. Even if you didn't think you were paid that well, you can still take proud. Oh, I did that right. So, and that's what it is. It just isn't enough to just do other people's work.
Sure.